There's a lake house in Wisconsin that keeps getting cheaper every time it's sold because every woman who lives there eventually walks into the lake at night and never comes back. There is a house on a lake in rural Wisconsin that has been sold 3 times in 10 years. Every time it sells, the price drops. Every time it is a young couple who moves in, and every time it is the wife who starts having trouble sleeping. This is the story of one of those women. She posted it under the name Miss Snoot, not her real name, not the real name of the lake. She lived in that house for 8 months. She made it out. The woman before her did not. Her husband's name for this telling is Ethan. They got married the previous April. Both were in their late 20s, together since college, happy in the uncomplicated way of people who have not yet been tested. The wedding was small and perfect. After it, they began looking for something outside Milwaukee. They had been talking for months about getting out. The listing appeared in early May. 3 bedrooms, a lake, a dock, a wide porch facing the water, and a price so far below their budget that she triple-checked it to make sure the listing wasn't a scam. It wasn't. The price was real. Their realtor said the previous owners had relocated and were motivated to sell. When asked why they'd left, the realtor said it was for work. That was enough. They moved in May, and for 4 months, it was everything they'd hoped it would be. The lake was the thing they loved most. Mid-sized, clear in the shallows, you could see the sandy bottom 15 or 20 feet out before the water darkened from pale green to deep green, then to a black that swallowed all light entirely. She swam in it almost every day that summer. Ethan fished off the dock in the evenings. Most nights they shared a bottle of wine on the porch and watched the sun go down over the water. Their cats, Poppy and Noodle, sat in the windows and watched the lake as though it were their own private nature documentary. Poppy was a calico, adopted from a shelter during college, nervous, skittish, opinionated, and utterly devoted to her. She slept on her chest every night and followed her from room to room with a purr loud enough to hear through a closed door. Noodle was a large orange tabby who was afraid of nothing and had once fallen asleep on top of a running vacuum cleaner. About a week after they moved in, they met the neighbor across the lake. His name was Darth. She apologized for the spelling, but had never heard a name quite like it. He was in his 70s, had lived on the lake most of his life, and arrived with a jar of homemade pickles. He was friendly but stoic in the way of older rural men who will talk about weather and fishing freely, but guard anything personal until you press him. It was Darth who explained the lake to them. Spring-fed, he said, very deep in the center, 80, maybe 90 feet in places, though no one had ever properly measured it, and it never fully froze. The springs kept the water circulating even through winter. Gets a shelf of ice around the edges, he told them, but the middle stays open, black water all winter. He said it as though it were just a fact, unremarkable. She noticed that in all the weeks after they moved in, she never once saw Darth go near the water. During the day, the lake was beautiful, but as summer deepened, she began to notice something about it after dark. It wasn't frightening exactly, just wrong somehow. After sunset, the water went flat and black. There was no texture to it, no reflection, no movement. It looked less like a lake and more like a void, a large, dark hole in the shape of water cut into the landscape. She said as much to Ethan one night. He told her she was being over-dramatic. She laughed and agreed, because it did sound silly, at least for now. She swam in the lake for the first time on their 3rd day there. The air was warm and hazy. Ethan was on the porch with a box of kitchen things he'd been half unpacking for an hour. She walked down to the dock in her swimsuit and stood at the end, looking into the water, clear enough that she could see the sandy bottom 8 feet below, the shadow of the dock posts, a single bluegill hanging motionless in the shade. "You're stalling," Ethan called from the porch. "I'm preparing. You've been preparing for 3 minutes. Just get in." So she jumped. The cold hit like a truck. Her body seized. She came up gasping and heard Ethan laughing. She splashed water in his general direction. It fell about 40 feet short, and he raised his coffee mug in a toast. She swam out 30 yards, past the point where she could touch the bottom, past the sandy shelf where the water turned pale to deep green. Then she floated on her back. looked up at the sky, then she rolled over and looked down. The green below her deepened by degrees, darkening through shades she could follow until they ended and left only black. The lake floor was gone. Below her kicking feet, there was no way of knowing how far it dropped, and for one moment she felt it, like a lurch you get at the edge of a cliff, but inverted, a gravitational drag downward. Her stomach dropped. She kicked hard toward the shallows. By the time she reached the dock, she was breathing fast and laughing at herself. It was nothing, just open water and an overactive imagination. "How is it?" Ethan asked. "Freezing, but amazing. Get in." "Absolutely not. You bought a house on a lake and you refuse to swim in it. I bought a house with a porch. The lake is your department." He did get in eventually. After that, they swam together most evenings, at least for a while. The water warmed degree by degree until by midsummer it felt like nothing against your skin. There was a night in late July that she kept coming back to. They'd eaten dinner on the porch, pasta, garden vegetables, mostly zucchini, and worked through most of a bottle of wine. The sun had been down for an hour. The sky held that deep, late summer blue that refuses to go fully dark. Ethan wanted to sit on the dock. She protested, told him she'd just gotten comfortable. He pulled her up by both hands anyway, and she complained the whole way down until they were sitting at the end of the dock, with their feet in the water. The lake was warm and still. The far shore was a dark line of trees. The other houses around the water had their porch lights on, small, golden, distant. It felt at that moment like they were the only real people in the world, and the lights were just set dressing. "We should have done this years ago," Ethan said. He meant all of it. The move, the house, the water. "We couldn't afford it years ago. We can barely afford it now. And yet," he gestured at the lake. She clinked her glass against the bottle. Behind them, a small, determined shape was picking its way along the dock with the exaggerated caution of a cat who found the outdoors personally offensive. Poppy almost never came outside. She regarded anything beyond the front door as a vast, hostile conspiracy. But that night, she walked the full length of the dock, sat down directly behind her, and pressed her forehead into the back of her neck. The full skull headbutt that meant, "I've arrived. You should be grateful." She reached back and scratched under Poppy's chin. The cat began to purr so loudly it rattled against her collarbone. "She's jealous," Ethan said. "She's supervising." Poppy settled against her lower back, a warm, vibrating weight. The three of them sat at the end of the dock while the sky finished its slow fade to black, and the stars came out in their full numbers, and the wine ran low. Ethan talked about a fishing spot a coworker had mentioned. She half listened. At some point, she felt something brush her foot beneath the water. A fish, probably, or a weed stirred by current. She pulled her feet up for a moment, then let them back down, and forgot about it. That was probably their happiest moment in that house. She wished it had lasted. One morning, near the end of summer, she came downstairs and found the sliding glass door to the back porch standing open. Not wide, just 6 inches or so. Ethan was already up making coffee. She asked if he'd opened it. He said no. She pressed. It was open. He said she'd probably forgotten to latch it before bed and the wind had pushed it further. She accepted this. The latch on that door was finicky. You had to lift and push to get it to catch. If you didn't do it firmly enough, it would drift. That must have been what happened. But she was fairly certain she remembered latching it. The feeling of the click, the resistance, the door settling into the frame. She latched that door every night. It had become a ritual. That particular door more than any other, though she couldn't have said exactly why it demanded her attention. She let it go and went on with their summer. The smell began with fall. It was like lake water, but concentrated, organic, silty, low tide. Like water that had rotting things in it, with a sweetness underneath that was closer to long fermented decay. At first, it was just a faint whiff in the kitchen in the morning, gone before she could be sure she'd smelled anything. Then stronger, a few days later, hanging in the hallway near the sliding door like a pocket of bad air. Then stronger still, settling into the back of the house in a way that no amount of cleaning could address. She went through the place with vinegar and baking soda, then bleach, then an enzymatic cleaner. The smell would retreat for a few hours and return as if something was generating it from below the floors. Ethan smelled it too, occasionally. He called it lake turnover, a real meteorological phenomenon, where autumn temperature changes cause deep water to rise and surface water to sink, releasing decomposition gases from the bottom. It happens. It produces a sulfurous, organic smell that can carry inland. She wanted to believe that's what it was. For a while, she did. But lake turnover smells from outside, coming off the water. This smell was inside the house. It was strongest at the glass door, in the hallway, in the back rooms. It was as if something had tracked it in and left it there. Some mornings, it was strong enough that Poppy refused to enter the kitchen. She would take one step in, freeze, then back out. And then Poppy's behavior changed in a way that went beyond avoiding the smell. Sometime in mid-September, Poppy stopped going near the back of the house entirely. She'd always been a creature of routine. Kitchen in the morning, living room window during the day, bedroom at night. Her path took her through the hallway past the sliding door a dozen times a day. Then one day, she simply stopped. She would walk to a point in the hallway, roughly where the glass door became visible at the end of the corridor, and she would sit there and stare at it. Not at the lake outside, at the door itself. She would sit there for an hour at a time, perfectly still, except for a low growl that sounded more frightened than angry. Noodle, meanwhile, continued to be Noodle. He slept on the couch, ate his food, sprawled in the window, and watched the lake with benign indifference. His total unconcern should have been reassuring. It wasn't, because the fact that Poppy felt what she was feeling, while Ethan and Noodle did not, meant she was on a frequency that only one other living thing in that house could receive, and that loneliness of being afraid and believed only by a cat was almost worse than the fear itself. By the end of September, she began waking up at 2 or 3 in the morning to the sound of footsteps on the dock, heavy, wet footsteps, like someone walking on wooden planks barefoot after a swim. The dock was 30 feet long, and the footsteps would traverse its entire length, then stop. She would lie in bed, eyes open, listening. Every time she nudged Ethan awake and he was alert enough to hear anything, the sound had already stopped. He'd sigh and tell her it was the dock settling, wood contracting in the cold night air. The first 2 times, she let herself believe it. By the 4th or 5th time, she stopped waking him. She would just lie in the dark and listen to the footsteps come up the dock and stop at the shore end, followed by silence. And sometimes underneath the silence, a faint, wet dragging sound moving slowly across the grass. One afternoon, near the middle of October, she walked out to the dock and found a trail. It started at the waterline where the lake met the shore, ran up the dock, crossed the yard, and ended at the sliding glass door. The grass was pressed flat and slick in a path roughly 3 feet broad, not a track or a line, but a wide swath. Something broad and heavy had moved from the water to the house. The grass was darkened and compressed. A faint sheen covered it, smelling of the same rot that had settled into the back rooms. The trail ended at the door. There were no return tracks. She called Ethan at work and described what she saw. He suggested a beaver, maybe an otter. She told him it was 3 feet broad. He suggested a deer that had bedded and dragged itself. She took photographs. By the time Ethan got home at 6, the grass had sprung back and the sheen had dried, but the photos existed. He looked at them. Then he looked at her. Neither of them had a good explanation. What they came up with that night was a dowel rod in the track of the sliding door. She placed it there every night after that. She checked it before bed, then checked it again. Some nights, she checked it a 3rd time just to give herself enough peace to sleep through the dragging sound outside. A few nights before Halloween, she saw it. She woke sometime past 2 and was immediately filled with dread. Not the gradual dread of a bad dream, but something immediate and full-bodied, accompanied by a compulsion she couldn't override. It bypassed thought entirely and addressed itself directly to her body. Get up. Go to the window. Look at the lake. There was no fighting it. The best way she could describe it afterward was gravity, as though the window had become the lowest point in the room and she had begun to roll toward it. She went to the window and looked out at the water. The moon was up, 3/4 full. The lake was that flat, textureless black she'd come to dread, except where the moonlight landed. In that light, she could see the dock extending out over the water, pale wood on dark surface, and at the end of the dock, something that had not been there when she went to bed. It was low, crouched on all fours on the last few planks, close to the water. Even from 60 feet away, she could tell it was large, wider than a human, heavy enough that it made the dock look fragile beneath it. It was dark and wet. The moonlight caught moisture on its surface. It was shifting in small, stuttery movements, its weight rocking from limb to limb, not adjusting its position so much as struggling to hold a shape, like something that hadn't quite resolved itself into a solid form. From the top of it, where a head would be, something hung, long and dark, heavy with water, swaying slightly as the thing shifted. It looked like hair, matted, soaked, draping all the way down to the planks. It was facing the house. She meant to look for only a few seconds, long enough to identify what she was seeing, or fail to, then wake Ethan so that for once he would see it too, and she would stop being alone in all of this. That was the plan. A few seconds. When she looked at the clock, it said 2:47. She was certain it had been just after 2 when she woke. In her experience, roughly 15 seconds had passed. 45 minutes were gone. This was not her zoning out, absorbed in a strange sight. The time had simply disappeared. When she looked back, the dock was empty. She went downstairs. The sliding glass door was open. The dowel rod was still in the track, but the door had been lifted off the track, over the rod, and set back down. Night air moved through the gap, carrying that thick, immediate smell with it. She stood there in the dark and understood. Whatever had been on the dock had come to the door. It had pressed itself against the opening and breathed into their house. She closed the door, went back upstairs, got into bed, and pulled the covers over her face. She did not sleep. She lay listening until morning, but everything was quiet. She didn't tell Ethan what she'd seen that night. He hadn't been listening, hadn't been trusting what she reported, but underneath that reason was something else, something that unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. If he wasn't experiencing this the way she was, then maybe it wasn't about him. Whatever was happening here seemed aimed specifically at her. One night, not long after, she woke up standing in the backyard. She was barefoot in the frost, in her pajamas, facing the lake. The cold grass burned against the soles of her feet. The sky was the deep, starless black of pre-dawn. She was standing halfway between the house and the shore, arms at her sides, with no memory of leaving her bed or coming downstairs. She was just there. She had never sleepwalked before in her life. She went inside shaking hard enough to hear her own teeth. She woke Ethan and told him. The look on his face was real fear. Not dismissal, not explanations, just fear. It was, in an awful way, a relief. Maybe now he would take things seriously, even if what he was taking seriously was her health rather than whatever lived in that lake. It happened again 8 days later. This time, Ethan found her. He woke at 3 in the morning and she wasn't beside him. He went downstairs and found the sliding glass door open. He went outside. She was on the dock, standing at the very end, her toes curled over the last plank, looking down into the water. He called her name. She didn't respond. He walked out and grabbed her arm. She screamed, not from fear of him, from disorientation, pure and total. The terror of a mind returning to a body that had already gone somewhere without it. She collapsed against him, sobbing and shaking, with no idea where she was, how she'd gotten there, or how long she'd been standing over that black water in the dark. The next morning, Ethan installed a chain lock on the bedroom door. They latched it together every night, both of them checking it. For 1 week, it worked. The second week, she woke on the dock again, standing at the end, barefoot and freezing. The bedroom door upstairs was closed. The chain was still latched from the inside. The sliding glass door was open. She had no explanation for how this was possible. Ethan took her to a doctor. The doctor said sleepwalking is common in adults under stress. A new house, a new environment can trigger it. She prescribed a low-dose sleep aid. For 3 nights, it worked. On the 4th night, she woke on the dock. She stopped taking the pills. They weren't keeping her inside. They might have been keeping her from waking up sooner, from fighting her way back before she reached the water edge. Then, in late fall, Poppy disappeared. She wasn't in any of her usual spots. Not in the hallway, not under the bathroom sink. She searched the whole house, went out to the yard, walked the road in both directions calling her name. Noodles sat on the porch and watched her with what she could only describe as pity. 2 days later, she found Poppy. She was standing on the dock in daylight, looking out at the lake, because by that point, the lake was where she looked when anything was missing. And there was Poppy, about 15 feet from the end of the dock, suspended just below the surface, floating like a leaf, intact, fur drifting slightly in the faint spring current, eyes open, but the color had been drawn out of her calico patches, bleached out, faded, as though she had been in the water far longer than 2 days. She waded in to get her. The water in late November in Wisconsin is so cold it moves past pain almost immediately into something else, a deep, spreading ache that grows with every step deeper. By the time the water reached her thighs, her legs were screaming at her to stop. She reached toward Poppy's body. Something gripped her ankle, not like a fish, not like weeds, like a hand, strong and deliberate, with fingers she could distinctly feel, and thick webbing between them that pressed against her skin as it squeezed. One firm squeeze, as if to get her attention, then it let go. She grabbed Poppy and ran.